Hello and welcome to Scanner Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear AI researchers chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we will provide you with summaries and discussion about some of last week's most interesting AI news. And by the way, if you like that, we also have that in text form over at the Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai. Easy to remember if you want to check that out. But we'll go ahead. I am Andrei Kurankov.
And I am Dr. Sharon Joe. This week, we will discuss self-driving car struggles, as well as how AI can help human trafficking. We'll talk about climate studies based on AI analysis, as well as take a look at how robots are patrolling for antisocial behavior in Singapore. And lastly, we'll have some fun news on dead-end streets, confusing self-driving cars.
Alrighty, so nice mixed week with some robots and climate and whatnot. Let's dive straight in. So first up, we have our application news, starting with Waymo's self-driving taxi struggles with left turns and puddles, but is still winning over some Arizona riders. So Waymo has been doing a pretty small trial of this self-driving taxi service, basically like Uber or Lyft, but the car that picks you up has no human driver. It's just a self-driving Waymo car. And they started this a year ago. And now CNN Business went on a ride in the service and spoke with 8 Waymo customers who have used the service over the past year. And it's a pretty interesting article. They go over some of the comments, some of the limitations, but also kind of showcase that in general, people seem to like it and even prefer it to something like Uber or Lyft. And as someone personally excited for this sort of thing, I'm pretty glad to hear that.
I'm so excited. I don't have a license, so...
Yeah, I have a license, but I would prefer not to drive if I can, especially if it gets cheaper because of this sort of thing, which I'm guessing it will.
Absolutely. I think it definitely will. It makes sense for it to be cheaper. The human is definitely cut out of the loop here. I love how when you enter, there's a greeting that says, "Good afternoon. This car is all yours with no one up front." So I feel like they tested that of like the user experience person. It's like, let's make this friendly, but also tell them that, this is self-driving. No one is in the front seat.
Yeah, exactly. And they have actually some screenshots of the app, and it really looks like Uber or Lyft.
It looks exactly like it. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We have some details like that. The trips take a bit longer because there's still some kind of limitations. They avoid taking shared turn lanes, for instance, so they need to take roundabout routes. So that takes longer, obviously. But if you're using this to commute or anything sort of non-essential, which some of these people that were interviewed were, I guess that's fine. And you can just chill out and, arrive when you arrive and work on your laptop.
I love the strategy of avoiding, difficult situations. For example, they also avoid making left turns from a busy street into a neighborhood because, it's a little bit more of a difficult task for the self-driving car. So just taking an easier route, and even if it takes a bit longer, I think is a great, safe approach towards rolling this out. And of course, if it's too much longer, I think people would maybe start to complain. But if that is upfront, which I imagine all that information could be calculated upfront, then people and users will not be surprised. And I think it's a great way to introduce self-driving cars safely into a community.
Yeah, I think this is a great approach of basically taking it slow, taking it careful. I think an accident, especially a bad one, in this kind of early stage would be pretty bad in terms of, making it much less appealing. Whereas having this run for a year without any major accidents definitely points to this being viable. And I think we're starting to expand to some areas like the Bay Area. So yeah, I think it's exciting to see that this is ongoing, that people are using it even in a limited area, and perhaps we'll be able to use it in just a year or two, which I'm really looking forward to.
Absolutely. And on to our next article, how AI can fight human trafficking. So worldwide, there are actually 40.3 million victims of human trafficking, which is crazy. This is estimated by the International Labor Organization. But a startup that's based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, called Marinus Analytics, it has rolled out a set of tools that are AI-based called Traffic Jam. That has the goal of finding these missing people and to stop human trafficking and fight organized crime. They actually won the 2021 IBM Watson X Prize competition, AI X Prize competition. They actually won third place in the 2021 IBM Watson AI X Prize competition for $500,000. And this was launched out of the Robotics Institute at CMU, Carnegie Mellon University. What's cool is that they comb through millions of online ads in certain hotspots, particularly commercial adult services websites, and they search for various vulnerability indicators for human trafficking, and they flag, possible candidates for that, and so they can quickly, identify, possible victims of human trafficking.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised to see this. I wasn't sure how AI could be beneficial here in general, but this was really interesting. Where they have this vulnerability indicator. They have also, I think, something to help with missing person, where it can use facial recognition to basically see if there's a match for some missing person instead of having to have people do it manually. And what else is nice is the idea here is not to have any sort of like automatic response. It's really just filtering and highlighting some things that then professionals, crime fighters can then review, and it makes the process much faster, which seems like definitely something that presumably is needed given the scale of the problem.
Yeah, for some quantitative numbers on that point, they claim that in 2020 alone, Traffic Jam, that AI system that they put out, had saved 70,000 investigative hours. And the year before, 2019, they actually identified 3,800 victims of trafficking, which is large and impressive, both those numbers.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see this and see such a obviously terrible problem that actually is getting a lot of benefit from AI, it seems. And I'm often happy to see AI not just making a dent and, benchmarks and whatever, but actually being used in the real world in new ways. So it's very nice to see this for sure. And onto our next article, going on to some research, we have something that's a bit similar, actually. We have this article, AI analysis of 100,000 climate studies reveals how massive the crisis already is. And this is from Science Alert. So there was this paper in Nature Climate Change titled Machine Learning-Based Evidence and Attribution Mapping of 100,000 Climate Impact Studies. And the idea here is that there has been an exponential rise in the number of papers being published about climate change. The scientists here explain. And so it's getting harder and harder to basically keep track of all of it, right? In terms of just, getting a global view of the state of the research. And so here they used AI to sift through all of this, published climate science and had this deep learning language analysis tool based on BERT to identify and classify this, 100,000 scientific studies and basically find some kind of high level findings as to what regions have sort of more study, which ones have less, and stuff like that. So yeah, pretty interesting.
I think it's really cool to look through papers and scientific studies to identify geographical analyses based on where things are published and where things are studied as well. And I think this is a great way to help use AI or use machine learning here to synthesize all that information, because now we have too much, and they call it big literature. And I find that pretty funny. So, I mean, I think this is a great way of tackling this space as well as other spaces in terms of just keeping up to date and getting a sense of what is here, literally the global picture, but what is here, the bigger trend and bigger picture, based on all these small studies that might be more regional and local.
Exactly. And I think this is not uncommon in other fields. I think we are called meta-analysis papers. So
or survey papers, yeah.
Or survey papers as well, yeah, where you crunch a bunch of stuff together. But I guess the difference here is that usually those have to be done by people. And when you have 100,000 papers, it's not doable. And so they actually say directly in their paper that, traditional assessments are more precise in terms of not having any mistakes, whereas the machine learning assisted approach is doing more of a broad summary of a lot of stuff, but is more uncertain. So you get a kind of a rough, slightly inaccurate or maybe uncertain view, but you get it pretty globally. And the conclusions are pretty impressive also, that, according to a study, 80% of global land area already shows trends in temperature and precipitation that can at least in part be attributed to human influence on climate, right? So that's, a big number, and probably not necessarily surprising, but still it's good to see such a concrete sort of estimate on where we already are seeing effects of climate change, which is only going to get worse in the coming decades.
Andre says with a laugh.
With a sad laugh, knowing that we're just gonna wait around. It's inevitable, and we're just gonna live through all of it.
We will, I hope, live through all of it, especially since so much work is getting published in the space and just so much more attention is being given there. I remember just a few years ago, there was not that much work in the space at the intersection, that is, and it's just very exciting to see how it's grown, and now grown to a state where the survey paper needs to use ML to analyze all the different papers. And so I hope the trend continues towards that. And I feel like there's much more energy around it now.
Yeah, exactly. And also part of the conclusion here, it's nice to see that, there are all these local papers about different regions like America, Asia, South America, Europe, that are exploring how things are changing, and that no doubt will help with response and adaptation. And it also shows this paper some of the areas that don't have as much study going on. They have this lack of evidence in some studies because the locations are less studied. So that points to some areas where there could be more research done, and that also I hope will help kind of navigate and direct researchers.
Right. And on to our next article. Google researchers explore the limits of large-scale model pre-training. And this is in a paper by Google Research titled Exploring the Limits of Large-Scale Pre-Training. And this is aiming to look at what's that relationship between the performance on upstream and downstream tasks. So upstream, I reckon here is the main task that the model is learning towards, and downstream is like, oh, hey, given that we've train the model on this great upstream task. What are some downstream effects that we could use the model for later on? And they do a pretty extensive study, and the conclusion is actually one that is a bit more counterintuitive for some, and it's that scaling actually doesn't lead to a one model fits all solution. And they basically propose that there are different checkpoints that'll perform best on possible downstream task. In particular, there is not a single best checkpoint out there for every downstream task. And I think this is very much against the, I would say, common narrative now, which is that, we're going towards the one awesome model fits all. We will use it for all embeddings and all representations, and use it for every downstream task we'll have. And this is challenging that a bit.
Yeah, it's very interesting because this is kind of a timely paper in a sense, where even going to the early days of deep learning, right? A big part of why it was so powerful is that you could pre-train a big, neural net with a lot of parameters, lots of computation on some big task where you have a ton of data. So you can, for instance, do object classification. You just have images and you say this is a dog or a cat or whatever, and you have like 1 million of those. And once you train on that 1 million, you have some weights in your model, and you can still use that for other tasks like predicting if it's night or day, or doing facial recognition, things like that are not the original task. So that's the upstream, downstream. And here they have, 5,000 experiments or something on kind of newer versions of this that are popular recently, with parameters ranging from 10 million to 10 billion. So that's the large part where now the models are growing and have been growing for a few years. So yeah, I think it's the trend in AI has definitely been just make the models bigger and bigger, make the data bigger and bigger, and then magically, whatever else you care about besides this original pre-training objective will also do better. And here, yeah, they show that basically it's not that simple. You can definitely be smarter about how you train or where you look. So yeah, I think definitely interesting, a bit more of a nerdy side. So maybe anyone less technically inclined may not be excited, but personally I found this pretty interesting.
I find it really interesting, and especially that, Google's publishing it, because one, I'm not surprised that they're looking into it, because it's definitely a big question for them. They've come out with TPUs. They're like, we'll scale things as much as we can if that really will give us the gains we need. So it makes sense that they've come out with it. The conclusion from them is it is interesting. I would have been even more surprised if it was OpenAI who said such a statement, since I think it's a little bit of their spirit to go for the large scale and scale with numbers.
Yeah, and it's interesting. OpenAI did do some similar research with, I think, discovering the power laws of model sizes. So they did some of these trend lines. I don't know if they compared upstream and downstream. But this also showcases that, this is a very expensive paper to write. I don't even know 5,000 experiments with like gigantic models. That's probably millions of dollars of compute easily. So it also shows kind of the power that industry has now in making certain types of research that can only be done in industry. But luckily, industry right now, at least Google, Facebook, etc., are publishing a lot, and so I think it's still for the most part beneficial to academics and academia, and not really a problem. But it's interesting to see that industry can do some of these things that academia could never pull off.
Yeah, were we just talking about climate change, though?
That's true. And onto some other articles that aren't researchy, that I think are a lot more maybe close to real life. We have this one article: a new robots patrolling for antisocial behavior, causing unease in Singapore streets. So the Home Team Science and Technology Agency in Singapore has been releasing this robot Xavier on a trial to see kind of if it can basically do surveillance, basically look around itself and see if it can detect any sort of behaviors that are deemed antisocial. So that includes smoking, littering, um, various different things. Also, doing things like social distancing or putting bicycles on footpaths. And basically, the idea is it can alert its command and control center and display some sort of message. Yeah, it's interesting to see this happening. It seems like it's a little dystopian, but maybe not too bad yet.
Yeah, I am both surprised and not surprised that Singapore is the one rolling this out, because they do like their rules. Like littering has massive consequences, chewing gum, that kind of thing. Though I can see how it, especially for newer behaviors, it just feels like a lot to ask for. Oh, social distancing or something that feels like, if I messed up and it said I wasn't exactly 6 feet apart from this person, I was, 5 feet 11 inches. Will I get in trouble? And so I can see how that can sow some unease among the people.
Yeah, I think it seems early on in this trial, so I'm assuming we don't want to get too aggressive yet. But it does speak to, I guess, aspirations. Just to describe the robot a bit, this one is not cute, like many we've discussed before. It has this like 4-wheel base, kind of like a small Jeep, and then it has this kind of body with a screen on it, and then kind of like a weird top head with a camera that can see 360 around it. So yeah, it looks a bit like a robot police patrol. And it's similar actually to things that are being developed in the US with things like Nightscope that also are meant to go around and patrol and detect things. But yeah, I think it seems like generally a trend, and we might expect to see more of these sorts of things out and about in the coming decade.
Yep. On to our next article. Are under-curated hyperscale AI datasets worse than the internet itself? And this is an article about the paper Multimodal Datasets, Misogyny, Pornography, and Malignant Stereotypes. So a group of researchers have basically warned about the growth of AI training datasets and how, especially the super, super large ones, and how they are propagating basically the worst aspects of the internet. They have all these, problematic features that have not been removed when now, online platforms are starting to remove a lot of these problematic pieces of content. So the new stuff doesn't have it, but the old data sets that we're training on do.
Yeah, so it's something that's kind of been known for the last few years for sure, but this paper kind of points it out and studies it more carefully. And it's a little bit shocking in some sense, because it does describe how the authors had to themselves kind of go through it and detect some of the really bad things. And if you look in the appendix, there's a lot of explicit images, right? And they even say that there are, explicit images of pornography. There's malignant stereotypes, racist and ethnic slurs, and other things. And this is pretty normal for AI datasets because we have these massive datasets, 400 million images that can really only be made by basically scraping the internet, just covering stuff. Really not quite at random, but I assume without too much, assessment. So that's the consequence of this kind of a paradigm is the datasets do have a lot of objectionable content. And as a result, the models we train encode a lot of bias, like these stereotypes and so on, as we've seen already. So yeah, very good study to just point out how bad it is and maybe point towards doing things better, hopefully.
In particular, the work actually looked at a recently introduced data set for CLIP called Lion 400 million data set. And so it's a multimodal data set, has text and image pairs to help with the CLIP AI model that can, create an image or find an image based on text and is modeling that multimodally. And unfortunately, there's an example of this female astronaut. And with the text query, this is a portrait of an astronaut with the American flag. It gets a similarity of 0.27. Whereas with the text query, this is a photograph of a smiling housewife in an orange jumpsuit with the American flag. It has a similarity of 0.31. And so just a higher similarity, a cosine similarity score. So, obviously not ideal there, and kind of surfacing the fact that the housewife or that image and stereotype of women is a bit stronger.
Yeah, and it has some really kind of, if you look into the index, there's some very explicit, not quite explicit, but they have blurred photos of explicit things. And they have this result. If you there is a safe search option to avoid some of those things, but if you turn that off, if you just enter big, you get a lot of, these captions are not safe
big
for work.
Eggplants?
That would be a good one if that was most of it, but
I
don't think I want to say any of these.
We are not going to say any of these.
Yeah, no. Anyway, interesting paper, and hopefully will push the field towards doing better in this regard.
Right.
And to move on to our last article in the fun section, where it's not quite so serious as the prior few, we have dead end San Francisco street plagued with confused Waymo cars trying to turn around every 5 minutes. And this is from the San Francisco Chronicle, I think, or CBS Local or something. And yeah, it's a pretty funny story. There's this quiet neighborhood in San Francisco that now has a ton of traffic from these self-driving Waymo cars. And so people living there describe how kind of all day there's these cars coming there and just it's a dead end. So they come in, take a multi-point turn and head out. And apparently, there can be up to 50 cars in a day. So it's every 5 minutes. So yeah, maybe the robo-taxi dream isn't that near. I don't know.
I'm just like, update your model.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. The Waymo spokesperson said that they are doing this because of road rules. So apparently you can't take U-turn now, so they have to do this weird thing, which is a good excuse, I suppose, but still weird. And I think humans presumably would handle this better.
Right. I mean, it is for the sake of safety in a sense, because I can imagine, U-turns can be unsafe in certain situations. But it is pretty funny that this is happening, though it is unfortunate that it is disrupting people from sleeping in that neighborhood.
And it's been going on for like 8 weeks too. Yeah.
I mean, the quotes are hilarious. It's like, I noticed it while I was sleeping. I awoke to a strange hum and I thought there was a spacecraft outside my bedroom window.
Yeah, it's definitely a funny case of like AI being wacky, another person said there are fleets of them driving through the neighborhood regularly. And these people have talked to the drivers. This is still a beta phase about drivers in these. And they don't have much to say. They're just saying that it's programmed this way, and they're just sitting there letting it do its thing. So yeah, it's it's good. Waymo is in test phase in itself, I guess.
It's just funny because it feels like we unleashed an RL agent, which might very well be true, but like, the wacky RL agents in some of the Atari games, they just do really weird things that humans would never do when playing a game. And so it just feels like one of those is unleashed, and we don't have, it's interesting. We observe them and we don't have control fully over them in a way, or the people on the ground don't. So that causes this mismatch in expectations.
Yeah, I wonder why so many cars are driving by this particular turn. I guess it's 15th Avenue, so maybe there's a lot going on there, but I don't know. It's a pretty ridiculous story, 50 cars in a day in one place.
My guess is that, if they can't do a U-turn, maybe this is the only way to go in here to turn around or something,
Yeah. But it's still surprising that so many like go through this particular route, I guess. But in any case, I guess hopefully for those people living there, this can be resolved soon.
Yes, I hope so. And with that, thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast. You can find the articles we discussed here today and subscribe to our weekly newsletter with similar ones at skynettoday.com.